Okay, let's dive straight into it. Today, we're tackling some truly fundamental questions, drawing from a fascinating philosophical dialogue you've shared with us.
That's right. We're looking at, well, excerpts that delve into natural religion, basically. What can we figure out about God? If anything, just using reason and observing the world, not relying on scripture.
And the source presents this as a kind of conversation between three very different viewpoints. You've got Cleanthes, who looks around and sees, well, clear signs of intelligent design in the universe.
hmm Then there's Demea. He's much more mystical about it. He emphasizes that God's nature is just way beyond our understanding, and it's really our own suffering and limits that push us towards religion.
Right. And rounding them out is Philo, the skeptic. He's the one really questioning the arguments from both sides, isn't he?
Exactly. He's not afraid to poke holes.
Mm.
So our mission in this deep dive is to kind of navigate these different takes, get to the heart of their arguments, and see what insights, still hold up.
It really is like listening in on this brilliant, ages-old debate that surprisingly still feels relevant. Okay, let's unpack this.
And the way it's presented as a dialogue is interesting in itself. The source suggests this format is great for topics that are both like super important, but also maybe feel a bit obvious.
How so?
Well, the novelty of the conversational style can make familiar ideas fresh, but it's also good for really obscure, uncertain topics where, frankly, no one has the final answer.
Because it lets you explore different angles without needing one fixed conclusion. Makes sense.
Yeah, and natural religion questions about God's existence and nature seems to fit both descriptions perfectly, doesn't it? It's hugely important, but also deeply uncertain.
It really does. The source even says this format combines the pleasure of study with the feel of a social exchange.
We join the conversation sort of midstream. There's a young listener there too, Pamphilus, who's kind of like us, just taking it all in.
Right, we're like Pamphilus here. So let's properly meet the main players. Cleanthes first, described as having an accurate philosophical turn.
Yeah, that means he's sharp, logical. He wants clear, reasoned arguments based on evidence. He's the empiricist.
Okay, looking for proof in the world. And Demea. He represents rigid, inflexible orthodoxy.
Right, so he's holding tight to traditional religious beliefs. For him, it's more about divine mystery, established doctrine, than philosophical nitpicking about God's nature.
Mm.
He prioritizes reverence.
Got it. Less debate, more worship.
Pretty much. And then Philo, the careless skeptic. Careless here probably means more like free-ranging, not sloppy. He's willing to doubt, to question everything without being tied to any dogma.
Okay, so the scene opens with Demea talking about education, specifically Pamphilus's. He thinks natural theology should come last.
Yeah, way last.
Yeah.
After logic, ethics, physics, all that. He thinks you need a mature mind, sort of enriched by other sciences before tackling these big religious questions.
Why is that?
He believes that studying philosophy first, with all its uncertainties, can actually tame the mind, make it humble, before you approach the mysteries of faith.
Using skepticism to prepare the ground for belief. That's interesting. But Philo jumps in.
Right away, he asks, well, isn't there a danger if you teach religion too late? After someone's become a fully fledged philosopher, might they just reject it?
Good point.
And Philo also notes that Demea seems to be using skepticism kind of strategically to argue God is incomprehensible. But he wonders, is Demea really skeptical about everyday things?
Which brings up the whole issue of skepticism itself, like philosophical doubt versus how you actually live.
Exactly. And Cleanthes challenges Philo on this. He says, look, in practice, even skeptics act based on evidence. They accept complex science like Newton on light or Copernicus on the earth moving, even when it's really abstract stuff.
So Cleanthes is saying, if you trust evidence for tricky science, why suddenly get so skeptical about theological arguments if they also seem based on evidence? It's inconsistent.
Precisely. Be consistent.
Yeah.
But Philo turns it right back on him. He says some religious people are inconsistent the other way. They might reject simple logic sometimes, but then believe things like, say, witches, based purely on traditional superstition, not evidence.
Okay. So Philo's saying true philosophical skepticism follows the evidence consistently, wherever it leads, while some other forms of skepticism are just selective belief.
Yes, a genuine philosophical skeptic applies the same rigor everywhere.
Okay, so after that detour into skepticism, Demea brings it back to his main point.
Right. He insists that the existence of God might be obvious, maybe self-evident, but God's nature. Totally incomprehensible to us, utterly unknown.
We just can't wrap our finite minds around infinite attributes like divine wisdom or thought.
That's exactly his argument. He says those words, wisdom, thought, knowledge, They're human concepts. We use them for worship, for adoration, sure, but they have zero real resemblance to God's actual perfections. He's echoing thinkers like Malebranche here.
So God is something to be worshipped, maybe felt, but not really something you can pin down in a philosophical debate.
Yes. For Demea, God belongs more in the temple than in disputation in the schools. He even uses Philo's own skeptical point that our ideas are limited by experience to bolster his case. No experience of the divine, so no real idea of the divine.
Okay, and that sets the stage perfectly for Cleanthes to lay out his big argument, doesn't it? His positive case for God.
It does. Cleanthes relies entirely on a posteriori reasoning.
Meaning reasoning from experience, from observation of effects back to causes.
Exactly. He looks at the universe and sees this vast, intricate machine. All the parts work together, adjusted precisely for specific purposes.
Like a giant clock or a complex organism or even a building.
Precisely. He sees this incredible, curious adapting of means to ends everywhere in nature, and he thinks it looks strikingly similar to things humans design and build: watches, houses, ships, you name it.
Okay, so the logic is the the universe looks like effects we know are caused by intelligence, human designs. Therefore,
the cause of the universe must be similar to the cause of human designs, namely, an intelligent mind. The author of nature, he calls it. This designer resembles the human mind, just, vastly more powerful and wise.
and for Cleanthes, this argument from design, based on observing the world, is the only solid proof for God's existence and intelligence. He dismisses abstract arguments.
Yes, he's all about the empirical evidence. No a priori stuff for him.
And this is where Philo really gets going, right? He targets this design analogy head on.
Oh yeah. This is Philo's main counterattack. His core point is about analogy itself. He stresses that for an inference from experience to be strong, the cases you're comparing need to be, well, exactly similar, or at least very, very close.
And we have experience seeing humans build houses or machines. We see the intelligent cause and the resulting effect.
Right. But Philo asks, who has ever seen a world being made? We have zero experience of that.
So, applying the analogy from human crafts, which are just a tiny part of nature, to explain the origin of the entire universe, that's a massive leap.
A great disproportion, Philo calls it. It's stretching the analogy way too thin. It's
like finding one brick and trying to figure out how the whole city was built based just on that.
That's a good way to put it. And Philo asks, why stop at human intelligence as the only model anyway? Nature seems to have lots of other ways of producing order. Think about generation, like birth and reproduction. Or vegetation, things growing organically. Or even physical processes like heat and cold shaping things.
So maybe the universe is more like a giant plant or an animal.
Philo suggests it might resemble an animal or vegetable even more closely than a machine, if we have to use an analogy. He throws out some wild ideas just to make the point maybe the world grew, like a plant from a seed, vegetation, or was born generation.
He even speculates about the world being God's body or producing seeds like comets that grow into new worlds, just pushing the boundaries of analogy.
Exactly. He's showing the limitations. And he points out other problems with making God too much like a human designer, the anthropomorphism. If you're reasoning only from the effect, the world, which seems finite and maybe flawed, you can't logically conclude the cause is infinite or perfect.
Right. Based on the analogy to human work, maybe the universe is just a first draft. Or made by a less skilled junior deity.
Or, Philo adds, look at big human projects, ships, cities. They often have teams of builders. If we follow the analogy strictly, why assume only one creator for the universe?
So he's systematically dismantling the certainty Cleanthes feels about that design analogy.
He's showing it's suggestive, maybe, but far from a rigorous proof.
Okay. While they're debating design, Demea tries a different tack, bringing up that abstract a priori argument.
Yeah, the one Cleanthes already dismissed, the traditional argument for a necessarily existent being.
Remind us how that goes.
It's purely logical. Premise 1. Everything that exists must have a cause or reason for its existence. Premise 2. You can't have an infinite regress of causes, stretching back forever with no starting point. Conclusion. Therefore, there must be some ultimate being whose existence isn't caused by anything else but is necessary in itself. It just has to exist.
And that necessary being is identified with God. But Cleanthes isn't having it.
Not at all. He sticks to his empiricism. He argues you simply cannot demonstrate a matter of fact, something about what actually exists in the world through pure logic, a priori. His reasoning is, If you can clearly conceive of something existing, you can just as clearly conceive of it not existing without any logical contradiction.
So the idea of a being whose very concept forces it to exist. Cleanthes thinks that's incoherent.
Pretty much. He finds the term necessarily existent being to be, well, almost meaningless. There's no being whose non-existence implies a contradiction in the way a square circle does.
He also flips the argument about matter being contingent.
Right. He says if you argue matter could conceivably not exist, well, the same applies to God. You can conceive of God not existing, so God isn't logically necessary in the way the argument claims.
And he makes that point about the cause of the parts versus the whole.
Yes. He says if you can explain the cause or origin of every individual part of the universe, every particle, every force, then you've explained the origin of the whole collection. It's unreasonable, he thinks, to then ask for some additional separate cause for the universe as a whole.
So Cleanthes effectively shuts down both the a posteriori design argument, as presented by Philo's critiques, and the a priori necessity argument. Where does that leave them?
Well, it pushes them towards another huge topic, one deeply rooted in experience: the problem of evil and human suffering.
And interestingly, Demea and Philo seem to find some common ground here, at least initially.
They do. They both agree that the sheer amount of misery and wickedness in the world is actually a powerful driver for religious beliefs.
Yeah.
It makes people feel dependent, fearful, and leads them to hope for a better existence later on.
Philo even says that vividly describing human suffering is probably more effective at making people religious than any fine-tuned philosophical argument.
And he doesn't hold back. He paints this really bleak picture. Animals preying on each other, the torments of insects, disease, war, poverty, but also the internal stuff: remorse, shame, rage, anxiety, even the dissatisfaction that can come with success. He cites examples from history.
And all this suffering becomes ammunition for Philo to challenge Cleanthes' view of a benevolent, all-powerful creator.
Directly. He brings up Epicurus' classic formulation of the problem. If God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, then he's impotent. If he's able but not willing, then he's malevolent. If he's both able and willing, then where does all this evil and suffering come from? It's the fundamental challenge.
How does Cleanthes respond?
He tries to argue that, on balance, happiness still outweighs misery in the world. There's more good than bad overall.
But Philo rejects that calculation.
Completely. He argues first that pain, even if it happens less often, is often far more intense and leaves a deeper impression than pleasure. Think about severe physical pain versus mild enjoyment.
True.
And second, more fundamentally, Philo says it's just impossible for us humans to actually do that calculation. How could we possibly add up all the pleasure and pain felt by every single creature throughout all of history and come up with a definitive balance? It's pure guesswork. Cleanthes' position is uncertain at best.
So the sheer existence of suffering is a problem. But Philo goes further, doesn't he? He identifies specific features of the natural world that seem designed almost to cause suffering.
Yes, he details 4 circumstances in nature that seem to generate evil, but which, he suggests, an infinitely powerful and good being might have arranged differently.
What's the first one?
First, the reliance on pain is a primary motivator for self-preservation, alongside pleasure. Philo wonders, couldn't the system work using only pleasure or positive incentives? Why the need for agony?
Okay, what's second?
Second, the world is governed by general, unwavering laws. While laws create order, they inevitably lead to specific harms: earthquakes, droughts, diseases that affect the innocent. Philo muses whether a deity could make small, particular interventions to prevent the worst outcomes without messing up the whole system.
Like stopping a specific tsunami but leaving the general laws of physics intact?
Something like that. Third, the limited capacities given to creatures. We have finite strength, intelligence, resources. A slightly larger buffer, more resilience, he suggests, could prevent a vast amount of hardship and increase overall happiness.
And the fourth point, inaccurate workmanship.
Yeah, he argues that the mechanisms of nature often seem clumsy or poorly calibrated. They tend towards extremes: too much rain or too little, too much heat or cold, human passions becoming destructive. This lack of precision, this tendency to excess or defect, is a constant source of suffering.
So Philo's conclusion from all this?
His conclusion is that, based purely on observing the world, especially these 4 factors and the prevalence of suffering, you simply cannot infer that the Creator possesses attributes like human benevolence or perfect goodness. Even if you could somehow argue that the suffering is compatible with such a God, if you learned about God some other way, you can't get to that conclusion just by looking at the phenomena.
The evidence doesn't lead you there.
If anything, Philo suggests, the evidence points more towards blind nature, in different processes, rather than a loving parental designer carefully managing things for our benefit.
Okay, so as the discussion winds down, Cleanthes has to admit something, right?
Yeah, Cleanthes observes that a focus on misery, which Demea initially brought up to encourage piety, seems to have backfired. It's given Philo, the skeptic, all the ammunition he needs to attack the idea of a good creator.
And Philo basically agrees, noting how theological arguments tend to shift and adapt based on the critiques they face.
Right. Then Pamphilus, the listener, offers his own tentative conclusion. He finds Philo's skeptical arguments more convincing than Demea's orthodox mysticism.
But then Philo does something interesting. He clarifies his own position. He doesn't totally dismiss design.
No, he actually says he does see evidence of design, intention, order in nature. He says it's pretty obvious, even to a stupid thinker. He mentions things like anatomical structures, the eye, the hand that seem purposefully arranged. He even says studying science often leads people, insensibly, almost without realizing it, to acknowledge some kind of intelligent first cause.
So he's not a total atheist about design. What's his point then?
His point seems to be about the inference you draw from that appearance of design. He suggests the whole argument between him and Cleanthes isn't really about whether there's any analogy between the cause of order in the universe and human intelligence, but about the degree of that analogy.
It's a verbal dispute about how strong the similarity is.
It's exactly. Philo argues both sides essentially agree there's some remote analogy. We use words like mind or thought when talking about God after all. But they disagree profoundly on how close that analogy is, what attributes we can confidently infer, and how much certainty we can have. And disputes about degrees, he notes, are often philosophical dead ends.
Like the classic skeptic versus dogmatist debate, often just about how much doubt versus how much certainty is reasonable.
Precisely. He draws that parallel. Both sides still have to reason and act in the world, but they disagree on the level of philosophical confidence they can have.
Philo then distinguishes between a rational, philosophical kind of religion, which he thinks is very rare,
and what he calls vulgar superstition. He sees the common forms of religion in his time as often driven by fear, prone to causing social conflict, ambition, and sometimes even running counter to basic morality.
He also suggests that our basic human nature, our passions, desires, inclinations, often has a stronger pull on our behavior than religious doctrines do.
Cleanthes pushes back, defending true religion as the main source of comfort in life, representing a perfectly good creator who wants us to be happy.
But Philo gets the last word on that, suggesting that for many people, the terrors of religion, fear of God's judgment, hell, death, probably outweigh the comforts.
Yeah, that's a pretty bleak assessment.
So, Philo's final take seems to be that if natural theology, using just reason and observation, only gives us this extremely vague, uncertain idea about some remote analogy between the cosmic cause and human intelligence,
And if it offers no real practical guidance on how to live or what to believe concretely,
then its actual scope and importance, philosophically speaking, are pretty limited.
very limited. But then he leaves Pamphilus and us with that really provocative final thought.
Right, that becoming a philosophical skeptic, really understanding how limited our reason is when tackling these ultimate questions.
Might actually be the first and most essential step towards being a sound, believing Christian.
Wow. How does that work? Skepticism leading to faith.
The implication seems to be that if you realize reason can't give you satisfying answers about God, if you clear away those potentially flawed rational arguments, you might become more open to accepting religious truths based on something else entirely, like faith or revelation. It's a surprising twist.
What an incredible journey through these arguments. From design and nature to the incomprehensibility of God, the challenge of suffering, the limits of analogy, the different kinds of skepticism. It's a lot.
It really forces you to confront the boundaries of human reason when we try to think about the biggest questions imaginable.
And it shows how applying what seems like everyday logic to the scale of the universe or the depth of suffering can lead to really complex and often unsettling places.
Definitely. These aren't easy answers,
Yeah.
but wrestling with the arguments like these characters did centuries ago really does sharpen our own thinking.
So here's something to maybe mull over, building on what we've discussed. Philo pointed out how even scientific ideas that seemed solid in his day were fiercely debated. If things we can observe and test, like how the eye works or how planets move, were once so uncertain and subject to scrutiny,
How much more careful, perhaps, should we be when we apply our reasoning to questions that are vastly beyond our direct experience, beyond any possibility of experiment?
Yeah.
What level of certainty is really appropriate there? What stands out to you from this deep dive?